Let's take a break. Coffee break tayo. Mura ng cafecito.
Welcome to another coffee break where we're able to learn, discuss, and discover various topics. I'm glad you're able to join me on your coffee break today. So grab yourself a hot cup of coffee, hot cup of tea, hot cup of cocoa, whatever it is that is your pleasure, and we'll get right into it. Today's topic is social disorganization, and hopefully, I will be able to give you an overview of what social disorganization is, specifically the social disorganization theory that gives you an opportunity to really understand what's going on. And the question that I've been getting a lot lately is, well, why is community crime and delinquency on the rise? And why are we experiencing this now more than ever? The social disorganization theory will give you an opportunity to understand why this is taking place and put everything into perspective, because it's always important to know how things happen in order for us to have a greater impact in addressing and solving some of our issues. So if you don't have a pen and paper handy, please feel free to save this for future reference and make sure that you do take notes on it, so that you can hopefully better understand or review it when necessary. So in order for us to understand where we're going, we need to understand where we came from. So, the social disorganization theory has its origins in criminology, which is the study of crime and punishment and the causes of crime related to whether it's biology, psychology, socio-economic status, and of course examining crime in different places. And this is where criminologists try to answer the question, well, why do people commit crimes? And criminologists are definitely interested in why some people commit crimes and others don't. So we'll be looking at specifically, I think, the premier school of thought when it came to, or when it comes to criminology, and that's the Chicago School. And one of the main theories that was developed at the Chicago School was the social disorganization theory. And you're going to ask yourself, well, why are we using or looking at the social disorganization theory? And then, because we do work with communities of color, whether it's disenfranchised, underserved, et cetera, et cetera. Our communities need to understand the factors that contribute to a community's deterioration and or lack of services in order to have an impact or create, like I said before, sustainable change. So the social disorganization theory, basically, it goes back to about 1942, where two criminology researchers from the Chicago School of Criminology, by the names of Clifford Shaw and Henry McKay, developed social disorganization theory through the research that they were conducting in order to determine how crime happens and why some people were committing crimes and others weren't. So through their research and through the gathering of data information, the social disorganization theory also states that a person's physical or social environment are primarily responsible for the behavioral choices that a person makes, and at the core is that location matters when it comes to predicting illegal activity. Sean McKay noted that neighborhoods with the highest crime rates have at least three common problems: physical dilapidation, poverty, and a higher level of ethnic and culture mixing, which is what heterogeneity is, which was where some of the controversy stems from. Sean McKay also claimed that delinquency was not caused by or at the individual level, but it was a normal response by normal individuals to abnormal conditions. And just so that some of the controversy revolving the social disorganization theory was around the heterogeneity of the community, and then of course location mattered when it came to it being a precursor to increased levels of crime. But we won't discuss that. I'll leave it up to you to make your own determination. But social disorganization and the theory itself is widely used as an important predictor of youth violence and crime, and it has been used since 1942, and continue to be used today. Um, and under those areas, there are some very specific variables like residential instability, ethnic diversity, family disruption, economic status, population size or density of a particular community, and its proximity to urban areas. Uh, and all of this has an influence and can influence a community's capacity to develop and maintain strong systems of social relationships. And those social relationships are what are called the formal and informal controls of a particular community, which we won't go into today, but keep those in mind. And I'll be touching on those just a little bit as we move forward. Uh, and in understanding, well, who are the groups that are most impacted by social disorganization. And as we know, it's uh, the poorer communities, right? Communities that have suffered more, due to everything that is going on. And of course, that's exacerbated by the pandemic. And we'll leave it at that, and open again to your interpretation. Of course, we know that in a perfect world, everything would work a certain way. We'd have control over crime. We'd have all the services that we need. We have, access to anything it is that we as individuals, families, organizations need. And that's a perfect world. Unfortunately, we do not live in a perfect world. So thus we are where we are today. But we are constantly working to improve the quality of life for all of our, at least in the work that I do in the communities that I serve, and I hope that you're doing the same for the communities and the people that you work for as well. Let's look at the causes that lead to social disorganization, and these are put in three main categories. First one is poverty, right? The climate or the environment has created poor economic conditions. There's reduced conventional opportunities to make money and survive, whether that's through job loss, business loss, income loss, right? So the economic conditions are right for setting you up for poverty. Now that it's a more impoverished community, because that will definitely affect the formal controls of the community when it comes to institutions, nonprofits, businesses, and things of that nature. So now that there's a lack of resources to address these problems, exacerbated by poverty. And then that would definitely lead to the reliance on illegal or quasi-legal income, right? So now you people that have been affected by their income streams, now they're looking for and relying on illegal or quasi-legal income streams to be able to survive and live day by day. So that's one of the main categories that causes and leads to social disorganization. The next one is residential turnover. And now you're experiencing residential turnover because of the residential instability, and that's because the poor economic conditions were created. Now you have folks that aren't able to pay their rent, pay their mortgage, so they're having to move out of where they would normally be living to to a smaller home, smaller apartment, et cetera, and or because someone was incarcerated that was trying to make a buck and trying to survive on a daily basis. So now you have people having to move out of their home because they lost the mortgage, or they can no longer pay the rent because the primary provider was incarcerated. So that creates for constant disruption, where you have people moving in with others, or just becoming homeless, which is something huge that we're seeing, especially during the pandemic. And then, of course, that leads to impermanence, right? When we're talking about homelessness, the unhoused is, not having the ability or the economic power to be able to get themselves back on their feet, uh, and that's a whole new set of issues, right? So that's the second category. The third category, which is I think a little more controversial, is the ethnic and racial makeup of a community, what's considered the heterogeneity. Um, and that's because of the um, or not over concentration, but the high concentrations of ethnic and racial groups mixing, and this is allowing for and building on. Allowing for the different norms and values or perceptions about how to address or look at issues comes into play. And because now we have a huge communication barrier when it comes to those perceptions, or when it comes to the language itself, or our customs or our traditions in living a certain way, right? And as part of the ethnic and racial makeup of a community, you are now experiencing, as if you haven't noticed already, the shift between suburban and urban living, or urban to suburban living, and that's based, and part of it is because, we'll live where we feel more comfortable, and we move where our people are, and sometimes we avoid urban areas because our perception is that urban areas are more prone to crime and violence. So we leave and move to the suburbs. Now your suburban areas are becoming more prone to crime and violence, and of course, ethnic racial heterogeneity has a lot to do with that, as well as the poor economic conditions and the residential turnover that was part of that process as well. So these are the three main headings, or major categories that are considered to be the causes that lead to social disorganization. So jot those down. Once we look at the causes now, that lead to social disorganization, right? Now that you have all of your social processes that have been impacted because of these things. And, if we look at social processes, we'll think of those in also three main heads, or three main categories. And that's the cultural process, the political process, and the economic process. And this is across the board for any community, right? And when these become impacted, it definitely has an impact on the community itself. And that's, I think, the reason would be due to cultural lag. Right now, you have residents and community who are unable or unwilling to participate in their civic duties or volunteerism because of loss of income, right? The loss of jobs, and just trying to survive on a daily basis. So this is no longer a priority. And when it comes to the heterogeneity component, you have a lot of conflicting attitudes and values when it comes to how to address issues, and then of course, compounded by the communication barriers that's exacerbated, and especially now during a social crisis, which is another factor that impacts social processes. And of course, the social crisis that we're being faced with right now is the pandemic, homelessness, and many other things with like drug use and so forth. But when you have these things, cultural lag, conflicting attitudes and values, and social crises under the social processes, and that's being impacted, we'll definitely see all of this leading to a community's social disorganization, right? And that's when you have the birth of what's called social disorganization, and in effect, that's the inability of a community to solve its problems collectively or to achieve collective values, right? And that's because you have weak and unlinked institutions with no sense of community. And that has an impact on the family structure, right? Because all of the things that I mentioned before affect the family structure. You're no longer um, having family controls in place in order to keep the family together. Not everybody's doing their own thing, or the loss of individuals within a family to incarceration or death because of everything that's going on, right? The impact to schools. Schools are no longer able to keep their enrollment numbers up, thus having an impact on them economically, and having an impact on them um, physically, because now they're unable to help the community solve its problems when it comes to education, when it comes to keeping kids occupied with extracurricular activities, sports, education. Right, they're losing teachers, and so schools are definitely impacted. And then you have your community groups, right? They are impacted because they are no longer able to recruit volunteers. No one wants to give up of their time because they're focused on taking care of their families, or the community groups simply vanished and are no longer there, right? And that's because of everything that they've been impacted with, no longer allow them to be able to exist. And all this was gathered and through the research by certain assessment tools that were used, but the measures that were used primarily were determinants to population loss, right? How many residents were leaving the community? How many of these homes in the community were rentals versus owned homes? And what was the proportion of that? Income levels. You had an impact of people either completely losing their income or the transference and lowering of their economic status, where you have people who lost their jobs because the company that they were working for shut down. Now they're forced to work with a different company at a lower base pay. That all a lot of that then leads to, of course, what we could physically observe, and that's the physical deterioration of a community. Now you have people that really don't have the time or aren't spending the time to take care of their community, and that's either through the beautification process or the physical deterioration and dilapidation of buildings, because now they're left empty, now they're being sold or just abandoned. Right, and then of course the more controversial measure that was used was determining the percentage of non-whites that were in that community, and that speaks to the heterogeneity of the community. And the question is, well, is it a factor that you have such a high mix of ethnic and racial groups that has an impact on whether or not a community becomes socially disorganized? And I'll leave that up to you to determine, but it's definitely something to consider and something that we've historically seen. And I'm not going to say whether this is true or not, but in some cases it is seen that the higher percentage of non-whites in the community would mean, and as the information is extrapolated, it would mean that the less people would be involved in their civic duties within their own community. So under these three main categories, now you have the perfect recipe that leads to social disorganization, right? When there's an inability for a community to address its problems, and especially because, again, those three areas would be poverty, residential turnover, and ethnic heterogeneity, which are causes that lead to social disorganization. Once social disorganization is born, right, and this is the direct effect of social disorganization on delinquency. And what you're going to have, and it's what's going to happen, is that social or disorganization will produce the loss of informal social controls, and that's on parental supervision, and community controls. And it will also be ripe for spontaneous, unsupervised play or social gathering groups of youth and adults. And this, to say, is a definite vehicle for delinquency, right? So, thus, you've lost control over the youth and the adults themselves. They are now engaged in um, something called cultural transmission. And again, this is an indirect effect of social disorganization on delinquency. And, the delinquent tradition is transmitted across generations of youth groups. Or older gangs are transmitting delinquency to younger um, social groups or play groups. This will then become um, delinquent tradition, right? Because you have older gang members or older individuals who are sharing information with younger individuals, whether the individuals or gangs, right? They're sharing their delinquent traditions, their values uh, about being in a gang or being involved in delinquent behavior. Excuse me, they're also sharing what the rewards and the sanctions might be for being in the gang or for being involved in delinquency, right? This is what you're going to get out of it, and this is what you're going to get if you're not part of it, right? um, this transmission is the learning of a culture, and it's the learning of a delinquent culture or the learning of a gang culture. And these delinquent traditions produce persistently high delinquency rates in the community or neighborhood. And there's some definite empirical evidence that backs this up, not only then, as far back as 1942, but now in collecting information data when it comes to providing empirical evidence and proof that this is happening. And age spanning is definitely being collected and recorded. Um, when it comes to the role of older delinquents in their life histories as that data is collected. It's being proven that that's cultural transmission is taking place, and the emulation of and support of some of these groups, such as gangs or individuals, and then of course understanding that these all compete with conventional values, right? So the gangs values, so the delinquent values are gonna be different than the family values, and they're gonna compete because sometimes the um, the lines are blurred, and that's because they're going to be very similar in nature. And when you have a young person or an adult who doesn't have, excuse me, the support system at home, then it becomes difficult to compete with values and the rewards and the culture that's being offered through the delinquent behavior or through the gang culture itself. So, all in all, to say that um, when you have these three things, right? Poverty, residential turnover, and ethnic heterogeneity. When you have a community's inability to be able to solve its own problems, it's ripe for social disorganization, and then social disorganization, of course, leads to that loss of control of um, gangs as groups and delinquency. And we're gonna differentiate between both because not all kids are gang involved, right? And but you do have delinquency that's taking place. And then of course you have the um, delinquent tradition or the cultural transmission that's taking place from both parts, right? You have older gang members sharing delinquent tradition with younger gang members, and then you have um, delinquents sharing their delinquent traditions with their siblings, with their friends, with their co-workers, what have you, which then just becomes this never-ending cycle of not being able to control the gangs and the delinquency because it's a constant, right? And until we start addressing the informal controls and the formal controls in the community setting, that this circle of delinquency and the tradition of delinquency will continue. So that leads to the question of how do we combat social disorganization? And the social disorganization theory also um, made implications and addressed this. And the social disorganization theory implies that large public bureaucracies should become more neighborhood based and more open to input from the clients that organizations serve, from the constituencies, from the residents, and of course, it is being proven today, and it's being put in place today, and organizations, governments, uh, our society has adopted this and understands that this does work. The social disorganization theory also suggests that public spending and private investment must be concentrated in the most impoverished areas, which, if we look back in history and as the data shows, um, it definitely works, but unintentional effects of continuous social disorganization have an impact on this, and that's because corporations or private investments or governmental investments were being hit hard when it came to communities that weren't taking advantage of the resources that were being given them. And that in itself can be a controversial statement too, right? The social disorganization theory also suggests that family preservation programs should be funded, and this is because the family may be able to resist the negative or deleterious effects of social disorganization on their own kids, and that since strong families may also work together to reduce social disorganization. Social disorganization in their communities, that there should be more programming or more funding being put in this direction, and that's definitely true. If we look at history and we look at now, that this is definitely true. Um, but how many people are actually accessing and participating in family preservation, especially during a pandemic? Um, and I think the theory also suggests that helping inner city residents prevent delinquency is important, and it definitely is, and that's through the civic engagement, right, and trying to get people involved within their own communities to prevent delinquency. However, it's been tough. And I can definitely say that the pandemic has made it tougher because everybody's like trying to take care of their own, and especially if they are faced with some serious economic uh, barriers or problems, right? Uh, it's important to focus on developing a sense of community, right? And that's through the increase of community participation, strengthening and connecting existing institutions. But that's difficult when you're losing institutions in the community to begin with, right? So there's, who can you strengthen when there's no one there to be strengthened, right? Um, Ensuring that there are increased controls over children. But of course, during a pandemic, that problem is exacerbated because you have parents and caregivers and grandparents that are out there trying to bring food to the home or keep a roof over their head, right? And sometimes it involves including natural leaders into the equation, and that's the consideration of, yes, some of these gang members and some of these delinquents to come back and reform and correct the behavior for them to be part of the process to develop that sense of community, because whether we like it or not, they are still part of that community, but they are also a piece of that puzzle to help communities get back on track, right? And I think the social disorganization theory allowed for also, or implied that special interventions um, were need to be had, and that's whether it was through youth recreation, um, physical disorder remediation, and social justice type of frameworks, by offering whether it was leadership development, guidance sessions, parole supervision. Right, it's very important. Where I think that system in itself needs to be bolstered just a little bit more. I'm not picking on probation. I'm not picking on parole, but there's some stories, right? There's definitely stories that we can tell, so we know that these areas need to be bolstered and need to be improved in order to have a greater impact on the communities that we live in, because you have a lot of delinquents, a lot of gang members that are coming out of the system with no clue, right? And especially when there are systems in place to ensure that their reentry is more positive than negative. In too many cases, it's the same reentry system is hurting its participants. And of course, the interventions include school interventions, and ensuring that schools are able to provide intervention activity, whether it's during school, after school, and in some cases weekend opportunities. I know it's definitely a lot. Sometimes it is mind-numbing to try to get so much information in a very short period of time. But we start somewhere, and we need to start combating social disorganization because it's here. And whether we agree with it or not, there are many determinants that lead to a community's social disorganization. So again, in looking at social disorganization, I want you to consider as we research and we've studied the social disorganization theory, and whether you agree with it or not, there's a lot to be learned from it, and there's a lot still to be understood in order for us to have a positive impact. So in determining whether a community is socially disorganized, right, in proving that this is why crime is happening and why crime is increasing, there has to be three major broad headings happening. We have poverty, we have residential turnover, and we have a community's racial and ethnic makeup called ethnic heterogeneity. And then of course that in itself will lead to a community's inability to be able to take care of itself and address its problems. That's where you have social disorganization, and that's where that's born. That itself has an indirect effect on the loss of control of youth and adults, gangs themselves. They then inject their delinquent traditions into whether it's gangs themselves or the individuals themselves. And unless we address the loss of control over gangs and delinquents in the community, it will be a revolving cycle. And we have to address the reasons why we lost control, and that's getting back on track and trying to work backward. But it's very difficult in a pandemic, but not impossible. So I'll just leave you with that. And that's it for today's coffee break. So make sure you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this video. So get back to work or whatever it is that you were doing, and we'll see you on the next coffee break. Should you want a workshop on this topic, please feel free to get at me. Lates.